morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Chris Coulter, and I'm the Executive Director of the Berghoff Foundation. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to reflect briefly on a topic that is gaining critical importance in our field, the role of psychology in peacemaking. At the heart of any conflict and any peace process are human beings. It's our emotions, needs, fears, capacities that shape both violence and reconciliation. Every negotiation, no matter how technical, is grounded in human interaction. When I briefly supported the Colombian peace negotiations in Havana, or when I've worked in the Middle East, I've seen this firsthand. In Colombia, the victims' hearings, which were deeply emotional and raw, shifted the whole dynamics of the entire process. The parties moved from entrenched positions to more of a shared sense of responsibility to solve it. And what I've seen in the Middle East, in terms of intergenerational trauma, questions of dignity, dehumanization, but also the process of rehumanization, have all affected me deeply. And we'll hear more about it today. I think emotions are sometimes in our field treated as secondary or even disruptive in negotiations. But sidelining emotions can really derail a peace process. And we've seen this again and again and again. But when acknowledged and understood, emotions can actually unlock breakthrough solutions. That's why I believe that this new guide that we're also talking about today, Psychology in Peacemaking, is so essential. Based on many interviews, it really distills the practical psychological insights for both mediators and negotiators. It shows how what we call the human factor can affect outcomes much more often than we think. Actually, last year at the Berlin Moot here in Berlin, we brought together neuroscientists and mediators, and we asked, what happens in the brain when parties negotiate? This guide that we're launching soon builds on that dialogue, offering practical recommendations drawn from both science and fieldwork. And it's not just a report. It's actually a call to rethink how we negotiate. It urges us to develop psychological literacy, I would call it, as a core skill in peacemaking. Small shifts in approach, grounded in understanding of human psychology, can make a major difference. Why does it matter now? I think today we face more conflicts than at any time since the end of World War II. What we're seeing is that geopolitical fractures are deepening, trust is eroding in our own societies as well. And old approaches are not enough. What we need now is new evidence-based tools. And this guide, I would say, is one of them. I encourage all of you to read the guide, reflect on its insights, and try to apply them in your work. So let's bring the human dimension back to the center of peacemaking, where it belongs. Because only then can we transform complex conflicts into sustainable peace. I would now like to give the floor to Maria Esveld, Head of Security and Rule of Law Division at the Department for Stabilization and Humanitarian Aid at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. Welcome, Maria.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Chris, for giving me the floor. I'm very honored, actually, to speak on this occasion. We have all been looking forward to the publication of this guidance, Psychology in Peacemaking. As you know, the Netherlands has been calling for the integration of mental health and psychosocial support in crisis response since 2018. We started by focusing on integrating MHPSS in humanitarian settings in action, and soon started working on the integration of MHPSS in peace building, and accountability mechanisms. Therefore, we're very glad for Berkov's leading role on integrating MHPSS in peacemaking. Because exactly as you said, Chris, peace processes are not only a political and strategic undertaking, they are profound human experiences. And in ensuring peace is sustainable, it does not only depend on these political and technical agreements, but very much also on the psychological healing of minds and relationships and the resilience of individuals and societies. As it is always said, you cannot build a country on broken minds. Psychological support helps individuals and communities to recover, rebuild trust, and regain a sense of agency. It creates space for empathy, fosters constructive dialogue, and supports resilience in the face of setbacks. So when psychosocial factors are ignored or misunderstood, they can lead to deadlocks. But when they are acknowledged and addressed, they can become very powerful drivers for change. A strong example from the report is how a female negotiator was considered difficult to work with in a negotiation process and viewed as angry. Over time, a pattern emerged. Her strongest reactions always came up when the topic of minors in the armed groups was discussed. It was only later that negotiators learned that she had undergone a forced abortion. Her emotional responses were not about being impossible to negotiate with, but they were actually trauma responses triggered by that specific topic. Without recognizing and working through these psychosocial dimensions, even the most well-designed agreements risk being undermined and unresolved human pain. And by weaving these elements into peace processes, from grassroots reconciliation efforts to high-level negotiations, we not only increase the chance of lasting peace, but also affirm the dignity and the humanity of those most affected by conflict. We are living through a time where dehumanizing language and polarization are once again on the rise. In today's world, there's a dire need to work on rehumanization in peace processes. So to round up, integrating mental health and psychosocial support in peace building and peacemaking is a priority for the Netherlands because peace cannot be built on broken minds and broken communities. We believe it is vital to advance the emerging fields of psychology and peacemaking and are pleased to contribute to the development of practical tools for mediators and negotiators working in some of the world's most complex conflict settings. This publication is grounded in robust evidence and lived experience of practitioners, and it provides concrete guidance on how to design peace processes that account for trauma, identity, emotion, trust, and rehumanization. Berkov is at the forefront of this work, and we are very happy to be partnering up, and I look forward to the panel discussion of this afternoon. Thank you very much.
A warm welcome also from me. I am Beatrix Austin. I head the Conflict Transformation Research Department at the Berkov Foundation. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Maria Esveld, for these wonderful welcoming words. They have grounded us already in the relevance of the topic. We have a packed program, so I will proceed swiftly. And everyone has committed to really stick to their times, and you've done beautiful role modeling, no more than 4.5 minutes each, and I will strive to emulate that. I do want to take a moment of acknowledging, though, the long research journey that has actually allowed us to publish today and launch today this evidence-based guide to help mediators and negotiators to bring the human factor back into the work that they're doing to help parties reach common ground. It's a journey that's been accompanied by many negotiators and mediators. More than 40 in-depth interviews have been conducted. trips have been undertaken, not the least to Colombia, which has sort of heavily informed the first sort of set of this. We've acknowledged gratefully the support of the United States Institute of Peace, but also recently the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, because without this support, this interest, this passion, shared passion in the subject, we would have a harder time to really gather the evidence. And I'm glad to see that the passion is shared out there in the world, with well over 250 participants. Many more, I think, signed up to read the report and to look at the recording. Allow me to introduce to you the panel of speakers today and say a few words on how the event will be structured for the next hour, so that you have a view on the landscape. First, I would like to introduce Juanita Milan. Juanita Milan served as an officer in the Colombian military during the conflict with FARC-EP. In 2012, she received an unexpected call and was assigned to join the government's negotiation team, tasked to negotiate with the very people she had been fighting before. One of the few military negotiators present in Havana, she will give us some insights into what unfolded and how she looks back and reflects on how the psychology also was present in the room then. Today, she's a member of the United Nations standby team of senior mediation advisors, and we're very happy that she found the time to join us today. Second, I am very happy to welcome Neha Sangraika. As a negotiator, mediator, and author, she has extensive experience achieving positive outcomes in high-stakes mediations and negotiations. Her work includes supporting Kofi Annan during the 2007 election crisis in Kenya, and more recently, working with the personal envoy of the UN Secretary General for Mozambique, which resulted in a peace agreement and the successful disarmament and demobilization of over 5,000 former combatants. Neha's work in conflict resolution and track 1 processes has influenced national trajectories and has seen her engaged with actors such as the UN, the African Union, and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. We're also fortunate to count her among our Board of Trustees members, and we thank you, Neha, for joining us here today. I also would like to welcome, fresh from another meeting, Professor Lasana Harris. He's Professor of Neuroscience and Psychology at University College London, and he takes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding human behavior. I'm very glad to see you again, Lasana. Our last meeting is over a year ago at the Berlin Mood, which also was mentioned, where we were fortunate to could kind of break new ground together in the Brain and Peace Lab and to begin this reflection of negotiation and mediation experience in light of understanding the human brain better through the lens of neuroscience and psychology. Last but not least, I'm very happy to welcome Charlotte Hamm. She's a psychologist and a research colleague here at the Berkhoff Foundation. She's the author of the study that also has been mentioned and which we are launching today, Psychology in Peacemaking, a guide for mediators and negotiators. So when we talk about psychology in peacemaking, there are a multitude of psychological factors. We're focusing on a few here today. Those are identity, emotion, and rehumanization. And the way the session is going to unfold from here on out is that first we're going to have a presentation of the key findings of the study by Charlotte Hamm, which will then be followed by 2 very short teasers of storytelling sessions, where first Juanita Milan is going to reflect on her negotiation experience, which is then going to be sort of commented on by both Lasana Harris and Charlotte Hamm in light of the neuroscientific and psychological findings that we are proposing today and that we're wanting to take forward as guidance to negotiators and mediators. And in a second sort of consecutive round, it's going to be Neha who is offering her reflections, again, directly followed by Lasana and Charlotte, again, sort of reflecting what is being said in light of their findings. We're going to have a very crisp and short final sort of round of questions and answers, which we're collecting. We hope this is the beginning of our engagement with you further, and we will close at 17:15 here Berlin time, so in about an hour. With this, Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris, Maria, and Bea for these wonderful opening remarks, and welcome to everybody who's joining us today online. I would like to start with a little anecdote and observation. So before I was starting this project that looks at the role of psychology in peacemaking, I was working together with other colleagues here at Berkhof to support a peace negotiation process. And as often at the beginning of negotiations, there was a prisoner release. And you had prisoners that had been held in a military prison, and they were released now to join the negotiation table. So these political prisoners arrived at the negotiation venue, and they walked into the first negotiation session. And the other delegation walks in, the government delegation. And 3 of those members from the delegation are wearing a military uniform, the same military uniform the guards were wearing in the political prison where they had been held. And you can imagine what that meant for these former political prisoners who had just been released from the prison, were sitting there. And actually one of them approached my colleague afterwards and said, I couldn't focus at all. I was just feeling so anxious. And we know from psychology and from neuroscience what happens in the brain when trauma is triggered. We know that the brain basically shuts down, that we enter fight or flight modus, and that logical thinking, creativity, problem solving, all these tools necessary for effective peace negotiations are shut down. So this is just an example to illustrate, and Maya mentioned another example of the female negotiator who had to go through a forced abortion, who was triggered. So these are examples to illustrate that if there's a lack of understanding the psychological element and a lack of applying, in this case, a trauma lens, this can really lead to deadlocks and cause stagnation in peace negotiations. In these negotiations, they were very high level. So you had a lot of experts flying in on ceasefire, on transitional justice, on power sharing. There was a lot of thematic expertise. But what I felt what was missing was to really understand what does it mean psychologically when people who've been fighting each other come together. And that's basically how this project and the guide came about. And I'm building on important work from Bruna Soy, Gabriel Rifkind, and Dan Shapiro, who pioneered the work of psychology and negotiations. Combine this with the 40 interviews, almost half of them are from members of rebel groups. And I would like to now quickly share a presentation to show some of the findings. So what you can see here on this infograph is the different psychological factors that negotiators bring into the room. So you can see, for example, personality traits. Every negotiator has their own personality. You see identity, right? They have different identities they belong to. Gender identity, the ethnicity, whether they're from the government or the non-state group, and also emotions, their emotional state, and what is their mood on that very day. And also, as we heard in these 2 examples, the history of trauma and the history of war experiences. So these are psychological factors that every negotiator has, that they bring into the negotiation room and that affect to a certain level, positively, negatively, the negotiations. The other thing that can develop when adversaries meet at the negotiation table is psychological transformation processes. So basically, rehumanization can start taking place because these are actors. Often they've been fighting each other for a long time, but now they see each other face to face for the first time. And little encounters and interactions can take place that help to see the human side again of the enemy. Mindset transformation can take place during peace negotiations. During war, the mindset is to defeat the other, to destroy the other. And often that mindset is brought to the negotiation table. So they're still thinking, how can we defeat the other? But then there are certain processes unfolding where slowly they start to see, okay, how can we come to a deal that each of us can sell as a gain to our constituency, to our leadership? So there's a transformation from this confrontational mindset to a more collaborative one. And also trust building. So a lot of the people I spoke to said trust usually remains very low between these adversaries, but low levels of trust do develop. So this is just a visualization of the psychological factors negotiators bring into the room, as well as psychological processes unfolding when adversaries meet. Today, as Bea mentioned, we will look at identity, emotion, rehumanization. The guide looks at all of them, explains all of those, and then also offers practical guidance on how to support negotiations. And just to quickly situate this publication in the current landscape that we find ourselves in. So we are seeing a lot of geopolitical shifts, and we're seeing a major trend away from comprehensive peace negotiations. Comprehensive peace negotiation means negotiators come together, spend a lot of time together, focusing also on inclusivity and really trying to address the root causes of conflict. We see a trend away from that towards more transactional power mediation deals, where very few powerful people come, meet in a room, and make decisions. And that often lacks inclusivity, and that often does not really look at the root causes and the whys of a conflict. So even if that is the reality that we as peacemakers are now operating in, the psychological factors are still incredibly relevant. Even in these transactional peace deals, identity, personality, emotion, values is incredibly important. But this transformation process, that is more likely to happen when there is a more comprehensive agreement, because that also helps to change the interpersonal relationship of the negotiators in terms of rehumanization, mindset transformation. And that matters because when you negotiate an agreement, it's not just about signing the deal, right? It's about actually implementing the peace agreement. And if the negotiators didn't change their relationship, if there's not a minimum of trust and of seeing the other also as a human, it's really hard to collaborate on implementing the agreement. And in the case of civil war, to actually govern a country together. So what we are observing is, with a decline of comprehensive peace negotiations, a decline of successful implementation of peace agreements. So this is just to introduce the research. And now I would like to hand over again to Bea. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will hand directly to Juanita, who will speak about something that high-level negotiators rarely address in public, namely the inner dynamics of emotions and the role of social identity during negotiations. And Juanita, you will be followed directly again by Lasana Harris and Charlotte Ham before I come in again to make the transition.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and thank you for having me in this important event. I remember years back when I met Charlotte, and I was super happy because finally I was thinking about this subject, which I personally suffer, and I know that many of my former colleagues are in this call. So I was really, really enthusiastic about someone really thinking what's behind the negotiations and what's going on through the minds of negotiators, conflict parties, during track one negotiations. So I remember that many of the things that I shared, I was not thinking they were going to end up in a research. I was just, for the first time sharing these situations and emotions that happened to me and to my team. And I believe that, I don't know if the percentage is correct, but I think at least 70% of what happened in a negotiation are emotions that are never treated, dealt properly. One of the things that I still remember is one of my big bosses smoking more than 40 cigarettes a day, drinking 10 cans of Coca-Cola, and having, I don't know, a ton of coffee, and really not being able to speak about his feelings, because as we know, men are not used to speak about their feelings. And I was in a team mostly composed by military men and police officers. I was also a member of the security forces in the Navy. So there was not a place for us to, ventilate or discuss those things. We spent hours and hours on the technical issues, on the preparations, and how to deal with the counterpart, the enemy at the time. But we never had the time to properly address the feelings, the frustrations, the anxiety, the insecurity, even of knowing that you are representing a whole sector. But once we came back, everybody was criticizing us, and practically the fear of the country, thinking you're negotiating with the enemy, with the FARC, and what's going to happen to us. So all these feelings, all these emotions play a huge role in how you behave, and it might danger how you react to their counterparts. Also, I remember sharing with Charlotte that I always think, and I still think, that I don't understand why, for example, an Olympic team is composed by the athletes, but also a lot of coaches, trainers, nutritionists, all these people that are supporting that team. And they play a huge role in, winning a medal for a country. But when a country of negotiators or a team of negotiators is sent to negotiate the future of a country, it's just them. Maybe they might have a technical team supporting on the content, but there's no psychological support, someone telling them how to deal with these emotions in a proper way. I remember also that we either run or exercise a lot, dance a lot, drink a lot, or just deal with the emotions not in the best way possible. And especially, I still think dealing with this issue is super important on how you handle these things. Also the dynamics inside teams, because sometimes it's more difficult to negotiate inside the team, your own team, than with the enemy. With the enemy, you have a clear picture of what's going on, but inside the teams, there's also not a good way to deal with those emotions. So I truly support the idea of dealing with emotions in a better way, and understanding and digesting these emotions and channeling these emotions in a proper way to improve the negotiation strategy. And in terms of social identity, also, I used to practice one thing, and it was, these people, the enemy at the time was, they joined the organization when they were very young. So, and of course, they were protecting the cause, as they call it. And of course, it was completely the opposite of my cause. But there was no point of me challenging their cause, because the whole life existence and the belief system was kind of being challenged. We were trying to move them from illegality to legality, and that transformation caused a lot of fears on them. So what I did was not to try to challenge their belief system, but try to find the solutions. How can we move on? We already know what happened in our country, in Colombia. We have suffered from the same from different points of view, and we have been killing each other for more than half a century. So we know that there's no need for me to try to convince you that I'm right, and they're not going to convince me that they were right. But how can we move on? So not focusing on the past, on all the grievances that we had, because of course that's important, but we were in a team that we were supposed to build something. So how you move from the root causes to try to solve the issue together. And that's a huge challenge. And as Charlotte was mentioning, I think the only way to do that is with time and to try to build trust. And trust can only be built with, political will, good faith, but also working together for a long time. I don't think that can happen in a week or in a month. You need to spend a lot of time thinking, working together to be able to achieve that. And one particular example is when I was part of the Gender Subcommission and in the Ceasefire Commission. Two similar subcommissions, but with very different behavior. The Gender Subcommission was in charge of, including the gender perspective into the whole agreement, but it was mainly composed of women. And then the Ceasefire Subcommission was in charge of designing the ceasefire, but then it was mainly made by men, so 70% of men, whereas the Gender Subcommission was fully or 97% women. And the two dynamics were completely different. In my personal experience, the Gender Subcommission ended up being like a support system in a way that I would never imagine before joining that, because they were the enemy. But as women, we have suffered similar things. And we were suffering also from the discrimination from our men in the negotiation teams. So at the beginning, we of course didn't get along at all. They hated me. But with the time and trust, we started building a team that became the subgénero. And everybody was calling us the subgénero, no longer the government team or the FARC team, we were the subgénero. And that gave us, in a very weird way, a sense of purpose and a sense of identity. In a weird way, we're still enemies, but for that purpose, we came together as women to try to make the best of the agreement in terms of, benefits for men and women and all the diversity of Colombia. And as something similar but different in the Ceasefire Commission. Most of the negotiators were politicians and experts, but the Ceasefire Commission was composed by 90% members of the security forces. And weirdly, in that team, FARC and my team in the security forces, there was a sense of also belonging because we were from the military. And they also gave us a purpose and a commitment that we had to, design the best ceasefire possible and the best laying down the weapons system and the best monitoring and verification mechanism for Colombia, because we needed to gain the trust of Colombians. So those two examples, I think, when you're able to work in smaller teams in track one negotiations, that allows you to, of course, get to know your counterpart. And even though you're politically in opposite sides and you acknowledge that there's a lot of room to be able to become friends, but at least you have a common purpose and you have to work and you have to deliver. So working as a team, even if you still counterparts, gives you a sense of identity or belonging. And that, I think, that was very interesting and what really worked well in these two commissions. So let me leave it at that and get back to Professor Harris, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juanita. I think what I will try to do then is talk about some of the mechanisms for the processes that you highlighted, starting with emotion regulation, but also touching on the social identity piece. And Charlotte, there are slides you can share or I can share either way. Okay, so my work focuses on what I call human perception and the brain. So how do we see other people as human beings? How do we dehumanize others and how do we rehumanize them? And in my part of psychology, which we call social neuroscience, over the last 2 decades or so, we've done a lot of work understanding the brain mechanisms that govern a lot of the psychological functions relevant here today. I'll begin by highlighting this frontoparietal network there in purple, which allows us to do things like regulate our emotions or engage in what we call cognitive or self-control. Now, the brain regions identified here with these letters, the letters aren't very important. What's noteworthy is that these are all what we call neocortical brain regions. So they're parts of the brain that are more recently evolved. They're parts of the brain that are unique to human beings and separate us from other animals on this planet. And as a result, they're cognitive heavy lifters. So they take a lot of psychological resources when we use these particular brain regions. So if you consider emotion regulation as some type of psychological task you have to do, then the cost for that psychological task is quite high. Now, what's also interesting to note from this map, and you'll see it again when we get to the second part of the talk, is that this brain network interacts with the other networks that we have listed here, including networks associated with value and decision making, so how we make decisions and assign value to different things in the world, how we read ourselves, the salience network associated with interoception, and perhaps most importantly, the default mode or social cognition network in blue that I'll come back to, which is where our sense of self lives, but also is where we are able to understand other people's minds and begin sort of negotiating, for instance, in any type of context, or just having human social interactions. So if you go to the next slide, Charlotte. And so let's use empathy as one example case study of how emotion regulation can and does work for human beings. Now, when you think about regulating your emotions, the research suggests there are really two strategies that are effective. One is what we call reappraisal, so thinking about the thing that's driving your emotional response in a very different way. And that's literally the first process that occurs in this cascade of empathy. So, empathy isn't a singular psychological response, it results from this cascade of processes, and appraisal or reappraisal is the first step. So, in this cartoon, imagine someone is walking down the street and they pass a homeless person. That's one of the traditionally dehumanized people in most societies. That person fails to trigger an empathic response. You would typically get an empathic response from another human being when they encounter someone else who suffers. And so, why does this empathy fail to materialize? Well, one easy answer based on emotion regulation is just an appraisal of the situation. You don't recognize that this is a situation where somebody is suffering or requires helping. Now, this type of cognitive reappraisal or appraisal process is very flexible, and it's really a feature of the brain. The brain itself is really flexible indeed. If I short circuit that appraisal process, I don't continue the cascade that can then trigger the empathic response. So that's one example. We'll come back to some other ways you can regulate empathy when we talk more about dehumanization and rehumanization later on. Next slide, quickly, Charlotte. So what we've done is study this phenomenon a lot with medical professionals, emergency room nurses, and it turns out that things like your perspective taking, your ability to get in the head of other people, predicts both feelings you have of personal accomplishment for these nurses, but it's all sort of mediated through a second cognitive mechanism, which is our ability to get inside the head of the other person, to humanize them, to read their minds, and to see them as a full human being. Next slide, Charlotte. And so in brain imaging research, exploring these nurses, what's really remarkable is that you can toggle on and off these brain regions that govern these processes simply by having them think about performing tasks that they would typically perform in the hospital in a different context. So when they think about doing these medical procedures that are painful or not at home or in the hospital, these brain regions are responding very differently in these medical professionals, showing, I think, how easy it is for us to switch between these different kinds of emotion regulation strategies based on essentially the situation that we're in, the context that we're in. So if we're in a negotiation context where a particular social identity is relevant, that identity is going to govern a particular pattern of brain responses and certain outcomes that will be very different than if you're in a different context where another identity might be salient. As you pointed out, for instance, Juanita, when gender became salient in the subpanel, as opposed to the particular group that you belong to, the sort of political group. Last slide, Charlotte. And so to sum up quite quickly, what we've done in a lot of work in our lab, but many others, is track how these brain processes unfold, again, depending on the situation that people are in. So in this particular slide here, what we're showing is these nursing students doing a task in a procedural context or in a context where they have to communicate with a patient. Now, both types of contexts are part of their jobs, but again, their brains are responding quite differently based on what context they're in. Their reports of how emotionally exhausting the experience is, their confidence in performing the task. So all of these subjective experiences you have potentially of the negotiation process are really governed by these contexts because these contexts provide us a way of regulating our emotions without having to consciously engage this very expensive network in our brain to bring cognitive control to bear to regulate these emotions. So social identity, the situations we're in, these are very big factors that provide very handy emotion regulation tools to allow us essentially to engage the parts of the brain that might be beneficial for the negotiation process and to help us regulate the emotional experiences we have that can be triggered in these situations as well. So I'll pause here and then pass on to Neha, I think, who's next, to pick it up.
Actually, I'm going to come
Oh,
in
to
again.
Charlotte? Okay, sorry.
Yes, so I think a couple of elements that Juanita mentioned and that really came up over and over again during the interviews that I did is that a lot of negotiators, but also mediators, experience emotional overload and emotional fatigue with the intense stress of dealing with the negotiations, being criticized constantly by media, being far away from home, all of these factors. There is also a strong sense of loneliness and isolation. Usually high-level peace negotiations take place at venues that are surveilled. So you never feel like you can fully speak openly. Also, you can't call your partner or friend and really talk openly about what happens because these negotiations are secret. So loneliness and isolation are another factor. And then on top of that, really an absence of any kind of emotional support to these negotiators. They're just expected to function like robots and negotiate the fate of a country. And that neglect of emotional support is really almost like a duty of care, a lack of duty of care. And neglecting, sidelining trauma emotions carry heavy, heavy risk for the negotiations. We know they lead to deadlocks and we know they really harm the process. So this related to emotions, related to social identity. It's so interesting what Juanita was saying, that these rebel groups, they joined very young. So a big part of their identity is being a member of that group. And when you criticize that group and you attack that group and you say you're just criminals, you will get a defensive response, and it is not going to be very helpful for the negotiation process. And actually, talking about identity being salient, we tend to identify the strongest with the part of our identity that is under attack. So if somebody makes a sexist joke, in that moment, I'm strongly going to identify as a woman and hold on to my gender identity. So this here is quite fascinating if you look at the identity fusion scale. So let's say now A, self and group, it's me, Charlotte, and Berkhoff Foundation. And in the cycles are hardly touching, so we're quite separate. But then you see E, the most extreme form, where it's basically merged. So there is no separation between me and the organization I work for. We are basically one. And if you attack the organization, it will feel like an attack against the self. And here it's really fascinating because neuroscience shows us that the brain also reads it as an attack against the self. If your identity is fused with the group that you belong to, may it be the military, a rebel group, opposition, and that group is critiqued, your brain reads it as a personal attack and you react very, very strongly. So now, what does that mean for peace negotiations? So the good news is, and that is really exciting, what Lasana Harris presented, this cascade of how to regulate emotions. You are not born with emotional intelligence. It is actually a skill. We know from psychology it is something you can get trained in and you can get better on. So it's really important when we train negotiators and mediators to focus on emotional intelligence and to destigmatize the role of emotions in general. It's also important to keep in mind that if you attack somebody's identity, it will probably have a backlash, a negative response. And usually in the sphere of negotiation, there is this myth that's saying you cannot negotiate or compromise identity. You can negotiate power, you can negotiate territory, but identity is fixed. You can't put it on the negotiation table. But what Juanita just described is a very, very creative way for actors who support peace processes to change which identity is at the forefront, right? She was saying in the gender subcommission, all of a sudden the identity in the forefront was being a woman, and the new outgroup, the new other, were the men. And a lot of progress was made in that subcommission because the negotiation table is very confrontational, right? But these subcommissions, you have a shared aim and you have a shared identity. And during the interviews, what I also learned from the ceasefire subcommissions, which is very fascinating, is that these people had actually been fighting each other, right, on the ground. But when they met, they would exchange these war anecdotes and say, oh, we had you almost killed in the jungle. We had you all encircled. How did you escape? And then they'd say, oh, we had a tunnel. And they were like, no way, you had a tunnel. So really exchanging these anecdotes and bonding over the experience of having been in the military, having lost comrades, having fought on the ground. So this, I think, is a really interesting and creative way to play with identities and to use social identities effectively to make negotiations more effective. And with that, over to you, Bea.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And I think you all see our challenge. Each of these interventions would deserve a lot more time. However, we're going to move on to Neha. Neha, I would invite your story, your reflection into the middle. And again, afterwards, we're going to hear from Professor Lasana Harris and from Charlotte how those resonate with what they're finding in their research.
Hi. So can you hear me? Great. Thank you so much to Berghoff for this this work. I think it's a topic that's long overdue and definitely needs a lot more attention. I think I want to start with some anecdotes of how my experiences have shaped how I deal with peace processes now. And there are a few examples that I have. When I was working for Kofi Annan in the Kenya peace process, I was 26, and I saw him as a sort of a star, which of course he is, and I didn't really think of him as human. So whenever there was a lot of there was 41 days of mediation, there was a big classical peace process ongoing. And there was a lot of attention demanded on the time of Kofi Annan. And I was responsible for the schedule and, who gets, how many minutes, etc. And I remember I never really thought about him as a person, just more as an entity. And I was so obsessed with proving myself and how efficient I was that I packed his schedule every single day, every single minute, not understanding that might not be the best way to go about things. And I remember about a week in, he took me to the side, and this is one thing that's shaped the way I think about things, because as well-meaning as people are, even the best of us forget that everyone is human, right? And so he took me aside and he said, you have to also think about me and my time. And just because there's a request for a meeting, which of course there were thousands, it doesn't mean we have to accept. When, we have to think, we have to stay calm, we need to build in time. And that led me to think about creating artificial time. So the concept of artificial time is very much involved in human emotion, because what you need to do is, in peace processes, when we're scheduling things, depending on which part of the world we come from, it's not as regimented. In the Mozambique process, much later, we realized that, I remember when I first started in Mozambique, there were two certainties from professors to civil society to ordinary people, anyone. There were two things that I consistently heard time and time again. One, the government will never share power, meaning decentralization will never happen. And the second certainty was Renamo, which is the rebel movement, will never disarm. And I was like, okay, so if those are two certainties, where do we go from here? And, having spent time here, we understood that language mattered. Not language in terms of the lingua franca of the day, but more language in terms of Renamo was considered armados bandidos, armed bandits. Juanita mentioned the enemy, this kind of speech. It's so integrated, ingrained when you have a conflict situation. So what we realized we had to do is, again, this issue of why dehumanize, how dehumanize, and then how to rehumanize. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about how we did it here based on our own experiences as well. The first thing we did is create a firewall to protect the mediation. Now, this might seem strange, but in order for progress to be made, two things need to happen. One, there has to be time to breathe, and second, there has to be the space to do so. And as we all know, especially now, with social media, with the attention on instant news, Insta everything, it's very, very difficult to you can't change the mood and the mind of a population, much less its leaders, in about 2 minutes. So we created a firewall of sorts around the peace process itself, and that meant that the protagonists, the mediators themselves, the support structures, they all had the space to not only get into the nitty-gritty of the technical work, but also had enough time to be able to deal with the pressure. So not everything was so fast and so quick. And I think this quite helped. The other thing is, we also have to, us as the mediators, I was working with Mirko Manzoni, who was the then Swiss ambassador, who was closer to Renamo. And he adopted something that I think also should be, utilized. And the basis of that was human dignity and emotion. And which is, when we have peace processes, now people come to the table, or they come to the city, or come to where it's comfortable for us. We decided from the outset, we would go to the bush as many times as necessary. So the two things he did were every week, every Sunday, phone Lakama, the Renamo leader, not for anything in particular, but just to talk, just to understand, because then it's both sides get to understand each other and how best to speak to each other. The other thing is that we kept going to the bush, even if it was out of our comfort zone regarding driving, climbing mountains, took days on end. And even when we didn't have any results, we kept going back. And the reason was the following: because the Renamo combatants who were in the bush, they saw some consistency. And we understood after the second, third, fourth visit, there was much more openness to speak. We were just not another actor trying to help. They had to start trusting us. And so that was one of the things that we did. The other thing was more subtle. I think in terms of we forget that when we're dealing with conflict, either in conflict, mediating, either way, life happens. In Mozambique, while the process was going on and while the conflict was ongoing, at the same time, you had, natural death, people dying. Lakama passed away in the middle of the peace process of natural causes. You had two cyclones, you had other conflicts, and then the business of running the country. So all of these kind of things puts immense pressure on then the mediation team and the negotiating teams. When the process was ongoing and the DDR started, came another whole sort of wind of emotion. And here's the thing. We put in place a process in terms of that everything should be equal between Renamo and government. And in the beginning, we remember that they didn't want to ride in the same car, didn't want to stay in the same house. When we formed the first monitoring and evaluation team in Gorongosa, the mountain, to monitor the ceasefire, it was all very separate, opposite ends of the room, opposite ends of the table, and there we did not insist that they should be together. We allowed for time. That's what I was talking about, creating the space, creating the time. Even if there isn't real time, you have to create artificial time in order to allow the human emotions to catch up with what you want. So we let it go. We're like, okay, you do you, we'll do the best we can. And after 6 months, we realized that they became friendly because they saw each other. The walls came down, the masks came down. They saw each other every single day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, even if they were separate. But they saw each other as humans. They saw each other as people. There was a commonality. One other incident like that marked me as well was when we were going back and forth from the mountain. We were escorted by the Renamo soldiers. And I spend a lot of my time eavesdropping on conversations. This is the best way I learn. So I've developed some sort of weird habit where I'll be speaking, but then I'll be listening to another thing that I picked up from my Kofi Annan days, where he would send me out into the community to get information from the ground. And I remember behind me were two soldiers, and Juanita might identify with this. And they were talking about going home. One day they will say, okay, maybe this is a process that one day we can go home. And they were saying, oh, but will our children, one was telling the other, will our children recognize us? And the other one said, oh, these days they have these tests. Maybe you could do a blood test or a test. And I just found that really fascinating. Suddenly, that drove home the point, again, of what we're talking about today. So in that moment, in that instant, that person for me changed from being an quote unquote, bandidos armados to a human, just a father who's worried that his kids won't recognize him. This and so many more anecdotes and examples make me think that rehumanization is always ongoing, even today. And it begins with how we listen, speak, how we choose to recognize each other's dignity across all the differences. I'm going to wind up there, but I'm happy to carry in this conversation further. And I genuinely also believe that this is a topic that's integral going forward. We need more of this, and we need more people to do what I like to call peace listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Neha. Very interesting anecdotes as well. And so again, my job is to talk about mechanisms. And the next one I want to focus on is dehumanization, where we've done quite a bit of work the last 20 years or so as well in psychology. The first thing to point out is that dehumanization is not one thing. There are many different types of dehumanization. So there's blatant dehumanization, which is what you typically see in propaganda messages if you go back. Yeah. This is the kind of dehumanization most people are familiar with. And this is essentially name calling, right? And so you think about this cartoon from the Daily Mail referring to immigrants as rats crossing the border into the UK. That's your classic dehumanization. The difficulty with this dehumanization is that it's more attitudinal. It's not necessarily tied to the psychological mechanisms that affect processes like empathy as well. And so we think this occurs often post hoc once there's already been violence that's occurred. The other more pernicious type of dehumanization in these contexts is what we call interpersonal dehumanization. And this is a more subtle form of dehumanization where you're failing to engage these mind reading processes, these mentalizing processes that are required for communication and social interaction. And this is the type of dehumanization that I think I'll spend most time talking about because it's less well known, but I think very relevant, particularly for negotiators in these contexts. Then there are two other types that I want to pay attention to as well. The first of these other two is called meta dehumanization. This is an awareness that you're dehumanized by other people. And so a lot of the work on meta dehumanization looks at stigmatized groups, for instance. People suffering with obesity is one example, and the awareness they have that people don't see them as human. This is very relevant within the negotiation context as well, as you can imagine. And then lastly, there's self-dehumanization. This is a dehumanization that occurs where you do it as a way of coping with negative moral feelings. So if you've done something morally bad in the past, you can dehumanize the other person, but you can also dehumanize yourself as well as a coping strategy. All of these different types of dehumanization rely on the same mechanisms. Next slide, Charlotte. Which is activation in this blue network that we talked about before, this default mode social cognition network. Now, this network is really crucial for us understanding other people's minds. It's what allows us to feel empathy for them. And by deactivating this network or disengaging this network, you've essentially engaged in dehumanization. Next slide. So, in a variety of contexts, we think about dehumanization as serving these very specific functions. It justifies past harmful moral behavior. It facilitates behavior that you won't typically engage in with other human beings, potentially violent behavior, but also other types of behavior, for instance, in medical contexts as well. And then it can short circuit emotional processes like empathy in the future. Next slide. So, given that dehumanization is functional, what we've done is been able to identify it in a variety of contexts beyond intergroup violence. So if you're looking at dehumanized targets or you're thinking about people within labor market contexts, if you're looking at sexualized images of women, if you're retaliating against a partner, and also if you're engaging in violence, virtual violence, the same brain mechanisms are active, facilitating dehumanization across this variety of contexts. So it's a very human mechanism. That is, dehumanization isn't something reserved just for the evil people among us. It's something that we're all capable of and something that is playing out in conflict situations for a host of reasons having to do with the functions I previously described. Last slide, Charlotte. Now, what's really interesting about dehumanization, going back to these brain networks, is that all of these networks interact. And so once you've dehumanized the target, you also affect networks engage in empathic processing, but also networks engage in morality and moral decision making as well. And so dehumanization works as a lever to switch off other types of processes that are necessary for negotiations, but also for resolving conflicts as well. And so I highlight these mechanisms as a way of talking about both the sort of prevalence of this phenomena, but also potentially the ability we have as human beings to rehumanize other people. When I spoke previously, I mentioned how easy it was to get these brain regions switched on and off because rehumanization is quite possible, right? It's within the realm of things that we can do as human beings. And I think I'll sort of pass over to the experts with the practical experience to point out strategies that have been useful in rehumanizing, particularly within these negotiation contexts. Um, I think I pass now on to Charlotte again.
Thank you. Yes, so it is so fascinating, I think, because we ask ourselves, how is it possible that we inflict so much pain on another human? But then understanding through your research, Lasana, that your brain does no longer read the other as a human. So if they suffer, if they're in pain, if they're tortured, we have no empathy reaction anymore, because neuroscience shows us we don't recognize them as humans anymore. That is, I think, incredible work you're doing there. And then hearing all these little stories that Neha was sharing about realizing, okay, this guy in the armed group, he also has his kids, or even Kofi Annan needs a break every now and then. So a couple of things about rehumanization and dehumanization. So of course, in peace negotiations, you don't have to like the other and you don't have to become friends with the other, but a minimum of seeing the other as a human is necessary for mutual respect, trust building, and these components that are necessary for peace negotiations. And actually, during my interviews, I asked the negotiators, what was a turning point for you? What was a moment where you felt like there's no going back to before, no going back to the conflict? And a lot of them mentioned these moments where they started to see the other, talking to their children, being nervous when giving a presentation. So when they saw the human again. And the guide talks in depth about these interventions that can be developed based on contact, based on vulnerability, based on what Neha also mentioned, commonality and shared experiences, so that a process can be designed that allows for these little interactions to take place. And a lot of that, we always hear that a lot of the negotiation takes place outside of the actual negotiation room, so that the venue allows for this informality, the chat at the coffee machine or going for a walk in the park, and that, yeah, these are included at the negotiation venue. And I think there's so much dehumanization right now. There's so much polarization. Modern day warfare with a focus on drones makes it even easier to dehumanize the other. So that's why it's so important to really study and understand rehumanization the way Lasana does it in the brain, but then also these different encounters that Neha and Juanita were speaking to. And with that, over to you, Bear. Thank you.
Thank you all so very much. In the chat, you might have seen it in the Q&A section, there's a fascinating conversation going on as well with people from all over the world sharing their experiences, their questions. With an eye to the time, I'm going to take the liberty to merge the last two things that we had planned. I would like to share with you, who have been our experts both in practice and in research, I would like to share with you some of the questions that are coming up in the chat. But then I will ask you all in a final round of reflection to just pick one aspect that resonates with you particularly strongly and that leads directly to the one recommendation that you want to leave us with, as what should we do next to walk out of here today? What's the number one thing that we need to keep paying attention to? Some of the questions that have come up really try to go deeper into this sort of setting of being in a negotiation. It's how do pride and honor influence negotiations, for example? How do you sustain what Chris called in the beginning psychological literacy and awareness for the dynamics that are going on in high stress situations? How do you still manage to do self-care then? Another question is, how important is common celebration in managing emotions? And another one is, how do you ensure contextual and cultural sensitivity? Something that also was very prominent on our mind when we started embarking on this research journey, because one of the things we wanted to contribute was really different perspectives. A lot of the the canon of negotiation literature is situated in Harvard and at the Project of Negotiation, but we want to bring in a lot more voices and a lot more perspectives. How do you look after yourself when you work in this area? But then we also have some bigger questions that chime, I think, with other crucial areas of negotiation that we are facing in this day and age. One contributor asked us, what do you see as similarity and differences to negotiating climate change at the moment? What would you think are most important things to consider there? And another one suggests, have you looked into polarity mapping, polarization? How do you separate personal identity from group affiliation or group identity most successfully? I think the forthcoming publication, which you'll find on the Berkeley Foundation website starting next week, is going to help sort of focus some of these questions. But for now, I would like to give those back to the group, back to the listeners, and ask you, and I think we'll go in the sequence that we had in the beginning with you, Juanita, going to you, Neha, to you, Charlotte, and then to you, Lasana, to pick one and then give us your recommendation.
Thank you so much. Well, I think it's important to let the counterpart ventilate everything they have to say, because it's important for them to, and the other side to really ventilate everything, to give enough space for them to really say everything they have to say, in the sense of acknowledging that the cause is important, but also our cause is important, so they can, get rid of all of those things and then start dealing with the technical part. Also, as I said in my comment, it takes time. So without the political will in the first place, the technical design, the proper technical part and experts, without training the human beings on those issues, how to handle emotions, how to handle feelings, how to address someone who's across the room telling awful things about your institution or your country or your beliefs, how to handle those things, not to affect the subject and the concrete things you need to solve. So, and here I will include my recommendation. I really think in every single mediation and negotiation team, we should include, coaches that allowed us to deal with these and teach us on how to address these emotions and feelings, and also to integrate behavioral science experts in every single team. Because I remember in my team, we had all the experts in the planet. We have been training in mediation, negotiation, ceasefires for 2 years. We were all professionals with more than, my colleagues, 25 years or 30 years of experience in the battlefield, but with no training on how to handle those emotions properly inside the team and, with the counterpart. So I think we're missing that part, and that's why many negotiations get, entrenched in these feelings that are placed as positions and not needs. So with that, I think it will be better and more fluent, because we have to acknowledge everything, but know how to handle those. Thank you.
Thank you. Neha, can I invite you to go next?
Yeah, sure. Can I take the one about cultural sensitivity? So, on cultural sensitivity, I think it should be a cornerstone of everything we do, because it isn't so much, you could speak the language of someone in terms of there is a great importance put on speaking Portuguese or speaking French in French-speaking places to understand. But there are so many times where you speak the language, but you don't understand the person. So when you try and understand what makes somebody tick, what they actually are all about, what is in their mind, what they're and the way to do that, or how to sort of cement that, would be preparation. I think 90% of everything is preparation, research, read the room, look, ask questions, because even the smallest thing can affect a process, and that boils down to emotion and how someone is feeling. So the more you prepare, the better. And for that, I'd say then my recommendation would be, we can't change the past, but all of us today can do something to change the future. And for that, I would say that invest in peace education. Just like preparation takes education, information, you need to learn, you need to read. How do you talk about or speak about a process without actually understanding and reading it, right? And knowing about it. So I think peace education would be something that would be amazing. That's something that should be cemented in almost every peace process from the outset. In Mozambique, we were a bit too late on that. We started working with the Ministry of Education to change the language in the curriculum. So once the peace process was at a certain stage where after the peace agreement was signed, we didn't forget, and that's one thing we did. And I would say that should be the center of that. But for all of us in the field who are in processes or out of processes, the same advice stands. Educate yourself. There's no excuse to not learn because it's out there now at the touch of a button. Thank you.
Yeah, I would answer the question on pride and honor. Actually, I think pride, honor, and dignity go well together. And I visualize it in the guide as an iceberg. And you have the official negotiations, the hard topics, so power sharing, political leadership, territory. And then you have what the negotiations are actually about: honor, pride, dignity, and that is constantly negotiated because during war you humiliate the other. So during negotiations they are trying to reclaim their sense of pride and dignity, and ways to deal with that. You can use classical psychological validation techniques. What they did in some negotiations is that they wrote down the words the others were saying and used those exact words when they proposed something to make the other feel heard, to make the other feel seen, and even mark that in red so that they can see, okay, this has been taken into consideration. So there are a couple of techniques in the guide where I focus on that, how to make sure that is also included in the negotiations. My recommendation, so we live in a time of intense militarization, and the military has long understood the role of neuroscience, behavioral science, psychology. They invest resources, expertise, money. And if we in the peacemaking community want to also say, okay, military solutions can't be the only way out, we need to invest in political solutions, in dialogues. We need to keep up with the military in the sense that we also need to talk to neuroscientists, psychologists, behavioral scientists to really understand what leads to human change. And if we have that special moment where negotiators actually come together and meet, that we then join forces and really support the best way we can in this interdisciplinary way.
I think I'll say three things, three general things. Um, One is that human beings are complex. We all have multiple identities, and often in negotiation, we get fixated on the salient identity. But there are lots of ways of finding commonality simply by tapping into the multiple identities that we all hold. And I think that's a strategy most negotiators are intuitively aware of. And that can be based on things that are similar or things, or just the process of becoming familiar with someone because you've interacted with them so often. The second point I want to make is the brain is inherently flexible. When I show things in the brain, it's not to suggest these things are fixed, but I show them in the brain to show how easily changeable they are. So it is very possible to rehumanize, to get people to regulate their emotions, to think differently about the situations that we're in. And oftentimes, I think we think about things as intractable. We use terms like intractable conflicts, but that's not how we're built as human beings. We're built to adapt and we're very flexible. And that has to really be kept salient. And then I think the third thing I would say is that at the end of the day, we're all human beings. These processes we've been talking about affect all of us, but we often do the very human thing of relying on narratives, stereotypes, ideas we have about other people without really appreciating their full humanity. And I often feel like We have a lot of solutions for many of these problems that we're concerned about. What we lack is the what I call the political will, right? The ability to recognize this common humanity that we all share. And so, really tapping into that sense of common humanity, I still see as a silver bullet for many of these situations. But that all happens within context. And so, the context we're in can push us towards behaving in particular ways that maintain the status quo, that make conflict sort of continue. And so, realizing the common humanity, but recognizing that has to occur within a particular context. And what we try to do in the negotiation will is shape that context, right? Because the idea is that the conditions in which we have people living under will determine the extent to which all of these psychological processes then cascade. So I'll just end by saying the work you do is very important. It's more than important. It's critical for shaping the psychological responses that we all have, including ourselves or yourselves as negotiators within that situation as well. So I'll hand back to B to end this off.
I thank you so very much. It remains for me to say thank you for today. Thank you for giving us an extra few minutes to hear a bit more. Thank you to our institutional and intellectual and practical and human partners in pushing this conversation forward. And I can say that at Berkeley Foundation, we remain committed. We remain committed to find and collect more evidence-based understanding of these processes and these dynamics, to foster more peace education. So in all of our contexts and all of our processes, we can actually apply our knowledge better, and to support both conflict parties and mediators and negotiators in becoming more psychologically literate, but also in being able to hold themselves and hold each other in this difficult but without an alternative path that they're treading. Thank you for today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.